Imagine you're reliving in the United States around the time of World War I or World War II. You survived the Great Depression, and now your country is at war. And if you think those policies would be too extreme for today, well, hold on to your hats because they're even more extreme than you might imagine. But that was just the start. President Woodrow Wilson declared Thanksgiving a national holiday and mandated that schools teach children about the importance of conserving food. That same year, the government passed the Lever Food Control Act, which gave the Food Administration the power to control the production, distribution, and even the price of food. The goal was to keep prices down and ensure that there was enough food to go around. Thanks to the experience gained during World War I, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, which aimed to increase agricultural production and stabilize prices. This act, along with the Food Stamp Act of 1939, helped ensure that there would be enough food for everyone. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Until next time, stay safe out there. So it makes you wonder, how did we fare during the World Wars? But they were necessary to ensure the survival of the nation. The threat of food shortages is still very real today, and it's up to us to make sure that we're prepared, whether it's supporting local farmers markets or learning how to grow our own food. Every little bit helps. And more importantly, what can we learn from the past to ensure we don't end up fighting over food in the near future? The threat of food shortages looms over you and your family. Rationing has begun. Not only were the US troops fighting overseas, but the country was also home to a growing number of people from the newly acquired territories of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Plus, the US was no longer producing as much food as it had during World War I, thanks to the Dust Bowl, a period of severe dust storms that hit the Great Plains in the 1930s. Now let's imagine you're watching this from the 21st century. Despite all our technological advances, food shortages are still making headlines. Well, the United States adopted some pretty extreme policies to prevent food shortages during the World Wars. The US government created the Food Administration, which encouraged Americans to eat less meat and dairy. But it wasn't just about keeping people alive, it was also about keeping them loyal. The government encouraged people to buy war bonds, and even offered tax breaks to families who had children serving in the military. And then came World War II, which brought with it a whole new set of challenges. But the government was prepared. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, the policies that the US government adopted during the World Wars may seem extreme by today's standards. I hope you enjoyed this little slice of history. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment below to let me know what you thought. And then there were none. And then there was one. And then there were two. And then there were three. And then there were four. And then there were five. And then there were six. And then there were seven. The first 10 people to send me a nice message about this video will be featured on screen right now. Oh wait, no, those are all fake names. But since Hoover was a firm believer in voluntary cooperation, he preferred cajoling to coercion, which meant a lot of public relation. And then they followed up with an explanation for why recipes should be off limits during a time when people were sacrificing for the greater good. Enter the Wheatless Campaign. It was the brainchild of Arthur Young, a member of the Grain Futures Committee, who hoped to reduce wheat consumption by 25%. His idea was to replace wheat with other grains, like corn and barley. But there was a problem, and in exchange for their support of the food campaign, he promised that Wilson would back the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, which passed 3 years later. Corn was too expensive, and barley didn't taste very good. Between 1916 and 1918, wheat exports increased by 40%, and the US went from importing 800,000 pounds of sugar annually to exporting 600,000 pounds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. The war also saw the rise of canning as a means of preserving food, and thanks to a federal program, millions of cans of fruit and vegetables were distributed to soldiers and families in need. But although Hoover accomplished his goal of keeping American bellies full, he would ultimately lose his lofty reputation when the prosperity he helped engineer came crashing down in the stock market crash of 1929. Young's nephew had a friend who worked at a mill that produced corn flour, which was ground from leftover corn after the kernels were removed. This product, which hadn't been commercially viable before, was eventually marketed as a cheaper, more filling alternative to wheat flour under the brand name Gold Meal. And, as an added bonus, it came packaged with a recipe book that included a kosher cornbread recipe endorsed by the head of the American Jewish Committee. But corn wasn't the only thing getting the Hollywood treatment. Sugar was also subject to scarcity, thanks to disruptions in shipping and the switch in European consumption habits. While Europeans were fighting, they simply didn't have time to consume sugar, and that led to a surplus. So to curb consumption, Hoover's Food Administration launched a sugarless campaign, which inspired patriotic Americans to cover up their cake stands with blue and yellow fabric to signal that they were participating. They also offered alternatives like saccharin and NutraSweet. Kidding. It was 1970. So, they didn't have NutraSweet, but they did encourage the use of molasses and honey. These campaigns wouldn't have worked without propaganda. With the slogan, "Food will win the war," the administration distributed pamphlets, posters, cartoons. At the beginning of the war, beef prices were higher, but by 1917, meat was selling for nearly twice its pre-war price. By 1918, the price of beef would double again, which made the 23% reduction in consumption seem like a minor inconvenience. The Meatless Monday campaign proved so effective that people continued to observe it throughout the war and even after. And even a comic strip called Uncle Sam's 7 Magic Words that taught children how to conserve food. One of the most famous campaigns was its use of heat. The Food Administration wanted to discourage people from cooking with gas, coal, or wood, because those energy sources could be used to produce metal instead. So Hoover encouraged Americans to cook on electric stoves or in wood or coal-burning stoves, preferably with the doors closed to keep the heat in. These campaigns also employed a sense of competition. For example, states competed against each other to see who could achieve the highest Meatless Mondays participation rate. And in towns across the country, canning bees and victory gardens became a way for neighbors to come together and do their part for the war effort. To start, he needed to get Americans on board. So he traveled around the country giving speeches and published articles in popular magazines. He also knew that he couldn't ban the use of certain foods, so instead he sought to embarrass people out of eating them. For example, he discouraged the consumption of wheat by calling it German wheat. Then he targeted dairy farmers who were producing enough butterfat by urging them to produce what he called Hoover cheese, which was made from skim milk. And he encouraged families to eat meatless Mondays to conserve meat for soldiers. Though Hoover didn't technically institute prohibition, he did launch an extremely successful anti-saloon campaign called the Noble Army of 1,000, referring to the 1,000 days it would take to end the war. Saloons were often gathering places for men to discuss politics or find work, so targeting them was a bold move. But dry agents descended upon saloons, carrying out raids that resulted in hundreds of arrests and the closure of thousands of establishments. Anyway, if you didn't know, the United States entered World War I in 1917, and when it did, it immediately had to contend with a serious problem. See, Americans weren't fighting overseas yet because Wilson had made the decision to not draft troops until the following spring, but even so, he still needed to mobilize resources, and for a young modern nation, that meant a well-coordinated industrial effort, something it was pretty good at. That's why the US would soon become the world's largest manufacturer of weapons, munitions, and fuel tanks. But these things take time to make, and in the meantime, Wilson also needed to fight a war on the other side of the ocean. It just so happened that said war was already being fought in part over access to food, so while ramping up production, Wilson also needed to quickly come up with a strategy for feeding his country's entry into the war, which meant the federal government needed to solve a logistics problem with a military solution. They needed to feed the army, so they started with the pantry, and then there were 8, and then there were 9, and then there were 10, and instead of scrolling Instagram, you're reading actual telegrams sent by Uncle Sam begging you to stop eating wheat. Why? Well, across the Atlantic, an industrial meat grinder called World War I is swallowing everything, lives, land. You see, after years of fighting, supplies have dwindled in Europe, and although we typically think of World War I as a war of trench warfare, 60% of deaths actually resulted from disease or starvation. Meanwhile, the US had plenty of both. So with American entry into the war, it became the supplier of choice for its European allies. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson realized that more Americans could be fed by shipping grain overseas than staying stateside. The trick was convincing the average American to willingly sacrifice their wheat, flour, meat, sugar, fats, and oils, milk, eggs, and cheese, in order to keep doughboys well nourished. Cue the entrance music for Herbert Hoover. No, not the one who gets blamed for the Great Depression later. This is Hoover, in his glow-up era. Sorry about that meme. He's cool again now. Anyway, he's appointed head of the brand new US Food Administration, and his job is simple. Feed the war effort, starve the enemy, and convince every American that they're basically a soldier in their kitchen. Okay, hey there, welcome to my channel. And here's a special treat. So you wake up in 1917, there's no Wi-Fi. Your coffee tastes like regret. The Food Administration took over the authority to allocate and distribute the nation's food supply. At the same time, the Food Administration began sending telegraphs to newspapers all across the country that read, "Stop the ink, stop printing the recipe." But some people needed a little more incentive. And then there was meat. As Hoover pointed out in a speech, there is no substitute for meat. If we lose meat, we lose the war. Meanwhile, knowing that success relied heavily on the support of women, Hoover invited several prominent suffragists to the White House for dinner. By the end of the war, America had indeed risen to the occasion. I don't know about you, but I sure hope that was worth waiting a whole week for. The year is 1943. A German U-boat has just sunk a ship carrying food supplies to Great Britain. Hitler thinks he can starve the British into but in America, there's a new battle being fought over kitchen tables. And no, it doesn't involve rations. It involves what you don't eat. Here's where it gets weirdly wholesome and slightly away. You're told to skip meat on Mondays, no wheat on Wednesdays. Sugar, yeah, tone it down. Butter, save it. Corn becomes the MVP. The goal was simple. Deny resources to the enemy. See, Germany was sinking ships and killing people, so America did what it does best. President Roosevelt took action. Roosevelt declared meatless Mondays. This might seem like a hippie idea. Okay, maybe that last one was a stretch. But the point was clear. By 1943, 14 pounds of sugar per person per year. And with all those pesky dairy cows giving birth every 8 months, milk was easy to come by. Can you imagine your neighbors in tracksuits picking radishes out of a community garden? Sounds weird. Doesn't work. During World War II, people spied on each other. You know, the type of thing that leads to neighbors turning on each other, friends becoming foes. Do you remember the good old days when you could grab a burger and fries, eat it on the lawn and watch the jets fly overhead without thinking twice? Well, those days were gone. By 1943, there was a price to pay for fast food. Well, kind of. No more burgers. But I hear you ask, what about chicken? Chicken was fair game. During World War II, there were more tin cans produced in 1 year than in all the previous years combined. Canned peaches, corned beef, hash, fried chicken with beet relish. It's all pretty wholesome, isn't it? But beneath the surface, things were changing. The government was spying on people's pantries. The media was telling parents how to feed their children. Neighbors were judging each other's victory gardens. Suddenly, food wasn't just food. This had consequences. Recycling became critical. People saved tin, aluminum, even bottle caps. They sent it to the government to be reused. Would you eat beet relish on your fried chicken? Comment below. And if you're watching this while eating a $16 artisan sandwich, just know a World War I grandma would have smacked it out of your hand with a wooden spoon and made you eat beets instead. But food cans couldn't always be reused. Sometimes they were too scratched up or too rusted. That's why millions of Americans took up canning. Every housewife knew how to preserve food, but now they were doing it on a larger scale. It wasn't just about feeding the family anymore. It was about feeding the future. As the saying went, can M dry, M pickle, M, or shut your patriotic mouth. They even held canning parties. Just make sure it's fried and topped with beets. Seriously, don't trust me? Check out this vintage recipe for fried chicken with beet relish. There's a link below. It was like living in a genre novel, except instead of nuclear secrets, they were trading gossip and recipes. Have you heard about Mary next door? She was hoarding sugar again. Shame. Her husband works at the Pentagon, you know. Makes you wonder. Aunt Jemima put out a cookbook called What Can I Do for the War Effort? It included recipes for dishes like pig and cabbage and salmon surprise. Salmon surprise. Wait a second, isn't fish meat? Well, yeah, but when the book came out, salmon was still considered a luxury item. Seafood was rare because fishing boats were needed for military duty. But as the war dragged on and the food supply chain broke down, seafood became more common. Still, catching fish was dangerous work. Storms sank boats, and submarines claimed victims. But fishermen risked it all because they were supplying the troops. And when soldiers ate well, they fought well. At least that's what everyone told themselves. The truth was that there was only so much seafood to go around. Eventually, even canned tuna hit the shelves. Your neighbor was a spy, your friend was a spy, your grocery store owner was probably a spy, and your sweet old grandma was definitely a spy. Maybe she was passing messages to the resistance. Maybe she was watching you. Boycotting meat meant protesting the draft. Farmers were patriots, and so were butchers. Some restaurants refused to serve meatless Mondays. The butchers boycotted them too. It was the ultimate slippery slope. Next thing you know, everyone's arguing politics over the price of prime rib. It was a minefield. Well, she was probably watching you anyway. Did you turn in your empty sugar and coffee cans? Did you throw out your stale bread instead of hiding it? Did you plant a victory garden? What size was your victory garden? Was it bigger than Mrs. Henderson's victory garden? If you didn't toe the line, she'd be the first to tell on you. She was armed with a camera, a notebook, and the unwavering moral authority of the neighborhood. She was a member of the Women's Land Army, a government organization that encouraged women to enter farming and food production. With 20 million men overseas, farms were struggling to stay afloat. The Women's Land Army provided much-needed labor, but it was also a way for busy bees to keep tabs on who was eating what. Why? Because I haven't gotten to the best part yet. But it turned out that butter was also useful for something called flak jackets. Not sure what that is. Well, see, when you churn butter, you're separating fat from buttermilk. That fat is collected and dried into flakes. Then it's mixed into flour to help baked goods rise. Without butter, cakes fell, biscuits shrank, and bakers felt blue. It wasn't rationing. It was wartime patriotism that led to butter being saved. For the troops, sending 400,000 pounds of butter overseas every month. That's 6 pounds less than the year before. But who was counting? Well, everyone. If you didn't turn in your sugar ration books on time, you might not get any sugar at all. Even worse, you might get stuck with saccharin. Oh, boy, that's bad. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds awful. Parents everywhere began hiding sugar in their pantry, sneaking extra sweetness into baked goods and withholding the truth from their children. Children everywhere grew up with false memories of unsweetened reality. Everyone had to participate, even if it seemed silly. At first it was hard. Wheat was in a lot of stuff, including non-white bread, like rice and pasta. But eventually, people found substitutes. Corn became the MVP. Corn flour became cornbread. Corned beef became corned anything. Heck, by the end of the war, you could even buy corn syrup made out of sawdust. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But it was actually a cost-cutting measure. Farmers make more profit selling livestock than selling meat. Plus, less meat means more grain for other things. Like, I don't know, gasoline. Sure, the public moaned about eating beans instead of bacon, but it was all for the greater good. Well, at least that's what we told ourselves. The truth was that rationing bacon helped Americans accept the prospect of rationing everything else. We retaliated with when Great Britain was running low on meat, America shipped 1 million tons of beef and pork. But soon after, German U-boats started sinking American merchant ships. In 1942 alone, 186 ships were sunk, killing 1,900 sailors. By 1943, people were asking, how long until it reaches us? The answer, technically, is forever, because the US mainland was never invaded. But culturally, folks were already there. They call it food will win the war, and it's plastered on posters, shouted from radio broadcasts, and drilled into school kids like gospel. Imagine the food pyramid, but your neighbors are bragging about their victory gardens, tiny backyard farms where families grow tomatoes, carrots, even chickens. Kids are raising rabbits. Got leftovers. You better can dry pickle or shut your patriotic mouth. Waste is treason. You aren't just feeding yourself anymore. You're feeding freedom. Yes. The home front. While the boys are off fighting the good fight, someone's got to take care of the home fires. And no, I don't mean the infernos raging through Dresden or Tokyo. Come inside. My family survived 2 world wars and an Italian dictatorship by cooking our way through food shortages and Allied sanctions. But in America, things were different. Things were good. The US wasn't yet in the trenches or having its cities firebombed, but people still had to do their part. And that meant following Uncle Sam's new diet plan. I mean, the fire's burning brightly in every American oven. See, it's not enough that Americans fight fascism overseas. We also have to wage war against waste. And yes, that means you and your fancy pants, culinary arts. No more of that highfalutin baloney, sir. It's time to get down to brass tacks. This is a culinary history of World War II. Today we are serving up the home front, and nobody does home front like my grandma Nona. As much as the US government loved bombing the snot out of Dresden, they loved nothing more than bombing the snot out of your dinner plate. If anyone could threaten America, it was our own appetites. Wheat was next. No wheat meant no bread, which meant no sandwiches, which meant kids would have to walk to school hungry. But no shortage was more painful than butter. Sure, margarine was available, but butter was better. Oh, and don't forget the victory garden. These tiny plots of land behind homes across America produced a whopping 40% of the nation's fruits and vegetables. In some communities, they kept lists of suspected hoarders. Suspected. They weren't even guilty, just suspected. Okay, that's the real John. Now let's go back to the wholesome version of events. You may think you're immune to propaganda, but during World War II, food was politicized. Eating meat meant supporting farmers who supported the draft. So I'll ask you again, could you survive on turnips, boiled cabbage, and potato pancakes for 6 months? Imagine a world without chocolate, not even for a day, but for 4 whole years. A world with no cake, no cookies, no brownies, no candy bars. The plan to restrict every American's access to sweets was hatched by none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, and FDR's eyes and ears. We rationed our gas. We surrendered our metals. We even repurposed our silverware. Why wouldn't we just skip dessert? The answer, my friends, is simple. Americans are stubborn. They unleashed a full cultural blitz. Cartoons, posters, celebrities like Lucille Ball telling Americans to learn how to cook without sugar. There were even comic books where Superman told kids to plant beans in the name of liberty. Yes, victory gardens are back. By 1944, these gardens produced nearly 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. All this to say, we grew a lot of food. The government used fear, propaganda, and good old-fashioned bullying to push Americans toward the perfect diet. In New York, people bought bootleg sugar from black market bootleggers. Well, it turns out the government had a sweet tooth. It confiscated more than 230,000 tons of candy and shipped it to troops overseas. Americans might have hated doing without their dessert, but nothing could be better than the sight of GI. Storekeepers sold rationed goods on the black market. Housewives traded recipes for items they couldn't buy, and even the president's wife struggled to feed her family. Still, rationing continued until the end of the war because no matter how unpopular it was, it gave the illusion of control. The government could tell the people what to eat, but they couldn't tell the people why. And maybe that's the real lesson. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on the battlefield, but in the kitchen. Joe digging into a box of Junior Mints. Nothing says thank you for risking your life for our freedom. Quite like a Reese's peanut butter cup across the country. Restaurants added an extra helping of salt to make their cakes taste sweeter. Well, maybe it is not such a great idea to wage war, unless you want to mess with people's eating habit. But more importantly, rationing isn't just about scarcity. It's about perception. People will adjust their diets if they think it's necessary. They won't even notice that you've taken away half their sugar. Just ask any Russian, Cuban, or North Korean. Come to think of it, maybe don't ask a North Korean. They served grapefruit as a natural substitute for oranges, and if they really needed fruit juice, they could always buy tomato juice. After all, it was technically classified as a vegetable. One thing they definitely didn't call it was ketchup. Did it work? Well, the bad news is no. According to economist Arthur M. O'Kuhn, food consumption barely changed during the war. The good news is, people found substitutes. Who knew there were so many ways to bake a cake? Corn syrup, beets, molasses, sawdust, chicory, carrots, plaster, and of course, saccharin. Saccharin became so popular that it caused a legal battle that lasted 11 years. Big surprise, it wasn't going to replace sugar completely, but boy, did people try. We wasted nothing. So instead of just politely suggesting that people eat less cake, we rationed it. By 1943, the average American was consuming more calories than before the war. The good news is, those calories weren't coming from desserts. Our culinary innovation led to new dishes like banana and butterscotch puddings, as well as a surge in Mexican cuisine. Because who doesn't love a good mole poblano? It turns out Americans could totally eat less candy, just so long as we could eat more other things. Officially with stamps. Everyone got a ration book. Your neighbor got one. Even your dog probably got one. While the food police were busy keeping tabs on our sugar intake, I was running around kicking butt as Captain America. African Americans migrated to cities in search of factory jobs, and Americans of all backgrounds worked tirelessly for the greater good. Italian American women made 15,000 hand-sewn parachutes. Native Americans picked up excess wheat from government warehouses to make 1 million Navajo blankets for servicemen. And Japanese American soldiers, despite enduring the most brutal conditions imaginable, kept fighting even after learning that their families had been unjustly imprisoned. Of course, they didn't know that at the time. No, our boys overseas fought under the impression that they were fighting for freedom. Freedom from tyranny, freedom from fascism, freedom from getting stuck without dessert. Okay, fine. That wasn't me. I wasn't even alive yet. But the point is, Americans love a distraction. Case in point, the first Captain America movie came out the same year that rationing began. As soon as we realized the threat of Hitler and the Axis powers, the government knew it could count on our patriotism to fill the void left by our empty stomachs. Having run out of ways to shame people into conserving resources, we turned to Big Brother. She brought together the heads of major candy companies to tell them what they had to do. They would limit the size of their products. They would ban partially eaten candy. And most importantly, they would introduce the concept of the sugar shortage. Then they released this public service announcement. Millions of people saw it. Some would call it the greatest propaganda film ever made. Others would call it terrifying. But regardless, its message was clear. Sugar was a wartime necessity. Candy was now the enemy. In fact, a world where everyone must surrender their Halloween candy to the nearest fire station. That would suck, right? Well, between 1942 and 1945, 78 million Americans did exactly that. Their job: set ceilings on prices, control inflation, prevent hoarding, and yes, ration sugar. How much sugar could you get? If you were a private consumer, you received £3 per month. If you owned a restaurant or grocery store, you got £1/4 pound per customer. But you couldn't buy all £3 at once. You had to split it up into £1 increments with a new purchase every 2 weeks. And if you wanted more sugar, well, you had to earn it. The OPA created a point system based on food group. Each food required a certain number of points. Let's say you wanted to buy an apple pie. An apple pie required 60 points. To earn a point, you either spent 25 cents or purchased a substitute item like nylon stockings for men. I'm not kidding. Or you turned in something made from scarce materials like a metal can. That's right. You literally earned points by recycling. This was not some bizarre dystopian nightmare. It was World War II. And this is America's secret weapon against fascism. And by secret, I mean not at all secret. But what happens when you take away the sweets from a nation that invented the cupcake? We did everything else the government asked of us. And in 1942, the Office of Price Administration became the federal food overlord. The OPA did more than just ration, though. They also tried to persuade. Did it work? Well, the bad news is no. So how do you control an insatiable public? You distract them with shiny objects. We bought war bonds. We volunteered in massive numbers. Women joined the workforce for the first time. And it wasn't just overseas. It was right here at home. In Mississippi, a former governor started a cottage industry making caramel from cotton seed. And finally, we come to the question on everyone's mind. What happened to all the candy we took away? So what do we learn from all this? So was rationing a success? Well, according to official reports, yes, it helped keep prices down and prevented hoarding. Episode. This was the age of the superwoman, running farms, kitchens, and entire communities like bosses before the term even existed. They measured their patriotism in ounces of sugar saved and jars of canned beans. Because if there was one thing Americans had in abundance, it was women who were more than capable of running the country while the men were away. Women kept working outside the home, but they also took on an expanded set of domestic duties. Here you will find a family gathered around the radio listening to the president's speech about the latest military victory or anxiously awaiting news about a loved one overseas. The war may have been fought on faraway battlefields, but the home front was the place where Americans grappled with the realities of total war, and men were expected to support their family financially, even if they were, well, dead. Learned about loss for the first time when a parent or sibling didn't come home from work one day, and never did. Each night families gathered to listen to the BBC, hearing first-hand accounts of the horrors of war. Magazines published sewing patterns for camouflage to help readers understand the purpose of blackout curtains. Hollywood produced propaganda films to drum up support for war bonds and train people on how to perform first aid. Musicians adapted their hits to include pro-war lyrics, and big band leaders like Glenn Miller incorporated patriotic medleys into their sets, keeping the public informed and energized. Enter the Zoot Suit Riot. In the summer of 1943, tensions between Mexican-American and white servicemen boiled over into 6 nights of rioting in Los Angeles. But, for now, let's head back to that typical home, where, in the bedroom, under the covers, boys and girls dreamed of futures bright, with hope and possibility, dreaming of the day when their fathers returned home, bringing with them peace and a whole lot of souvenirs. In addition to worrying about whether their parents would make it home alive, children were tasked with collecting scrap metal, rubber, and paper to be recycled. They collected rags for cleaning, fat for soap, and even hair for insulation. And they did it all with style, donning aprons that read, "I'm a junior salvage worker," and sporting badges that declared, "I recycle." As White G is returned from fighting abroad, they found themselves in competition for jobs with the very people they'd been fighting alongside. And that support took many forms. Everything from drawing pictures for hospitalized veterans to selling war bonds. And when they weren't busy contributing to the war effort, they were taking care of business by helping Mum and Dad grow that victory garden. For some families, those trunks held the last possessions of sons and daughters who never came home. And for others, they held the belongings of loved ones who survived the war but never quite came back. I'm your host. This has been The Homefront. If you'd like to support the channel, visit our website, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you next time. When servicemen saw Mexican-American men wearing zoot suits, baggy garments made from rationed fabric, they ripped them to shreds. It was something they heard about on the radio and saw reported in the newspaper. They knew that their fathers and brothers were fighting somewhere. But it wasn't until they opened their front doors and saw signs reading "Loose lips sink ships" or "Careless talk costs lives" that they realized the enemy wasn't always overseas. Sometimes the enemy was within, and glossy pages explained the importance of recycling old newspapers into newsprint, so that factories could stay open and produce tanks instead of magazines. Stories that were then filtered through the lens of propaganda and made their way to the front pages of newspapers across the country. People heard about the liberation of concentration camps, the bravery of British pilots, and the devastation of cities like Dresden, which would later inspire a famous firestorm painting by Norman Rockwell. But wherever it was tended with the same fierce determination by people who needed the extra food or simply wanted to contribute to the war effort. By the end of the conflict, nearly 20 million Americans were growing their own fruits and vegetables, and those who could unplant their own gardens got together to collect discarded bits of fruit and turn them into something delicious and nutritious called fruit leather. Rosie the Riveter flexed her muscles and asked, "Are you doing your part?" And the iconic image of the woman holding up a flag asked, "Loose lips sink ships." Posters like these appeared everywhere, reminding people that what they said, did, and wore could affect the outcome of the war. Here in the kitchen, a woman stood over a bowl of potatoes, scraping the skin with a vegetable peeler, saving every bit of usable potato and turning the rest into something called potato candles to be used for cleaning. Or she might stand over the stove on a hot summer day, making soup from scratch because the canned variety was in short supply, all the while keeping an eye on the victory garden planted in the backyard. My mother-in-law's aunt, for example, was a riveter at one of the many shipyards along the East Coast that churned out vessels for the war effort. She even got her own Rosie the Riveter t-shirt, which still hangs framed in my husband's grandmother's house. Well, not really. More likely they were gathered with other men waiting to hear the results of the latest football game. Even war couldn't stop America's favorite pastime, and they weren't going to miss a single minute of it. Men kept up with sports in the same way that they followed the news on the radio. There was no Uber Eats or avocado toast, just grit, creativity, and a wartime cookbook full of substitutions so wild you'd think it was written by a mad scientist on a gluten-free cleanse. By 1941, America was fully engaged in the war effort, sending men overseas to fight fascism, tyranny, and Hitler. But what were people doing back home? How were they contributing to the war effort from the kitchen table? And how were their lives changed by the entry of the United States into the Second World War? The first thing you should know about the home front is that the government was only one feeding the war machine. In fact, food was the most tangible way that civilians could contribute to the war effort. At the drop of a perfectly rationed carrot, families went from eating 3 square meals a day to conserving and stretching food for victory. Over the course of the war, meat consumption dropped by 28 pounds per person. That's equal to 360 Milky Ways. And the average American ate half an ounce less butter and 25 fewer eggs each year. Every bit of food not consumed was a bit of food saved for the troops. But the real genius of the American home front was the way that women stepped in to fill the jobs left behind by men who went off to fight. And yet, for all the progress made, the traditional gender roles persisted. Now, to understand how the home front functioned, we have to take a deep dive inside the typical American home of World War II. Here is where children listened to music from the Andrews Sisters, learned to make do with fewer toys. And for some, depending on where you lived, that garden might have been in a public park, on the roof of an apartment building, or tucked into a window box. In the living room, men sat with their backs straight, ready to defend the nation. Wartime radios were tuned into local stations or relayed broadcasts from London beamed into American homes on shortwave radio. Newspapers were filled with black and white photographs of fallen soldiers, shots of bombed-out European cities, and stark reminders to conserve food, clothing, and fuel. When it came to entertainment, nothing was off-limits to the war effort. And then there were the posters. Uncle Sam stared directly at young men and told them, "I need you." And even though most of us probably think of World War II as a time of selfless sacrifice, the truth is it was also marked by some pretty questionable choices. If you want to learn more about the Zoot Suit riots, be sure to check out the link in the description below. In the attic, trunks sat packed with belongings, sometimes containing the last things a soldier wore when they shipped out, or the very bed they slept in when they trained at Fort Jackson. It wasn't easy being a kid during World War II. World War II was the first modern war where children were formally mobilized to support the war effort. For children, the war was something that happened in faraway places. Alright, you've trimmed your meat, grown your victory garden, and bartered half a jar of jam for a ration coupon. You're feeling pretty patriotic. But let us not pretend this wartime system was all rosy-cheeked, kids picking cucumbers under Uncle Sam's warm gaze. The government has decided that you are not allowed to waste food. In fact, they've decided how much of everything you are allowed to eat. So you turn to the next best thing, Uncle Sam. And thankfully, the government actually agrees with you. Cheese and chocolate are both listed on the list of permissible foods for civilians. He's not one to turn down a proposition either. People are willing to pay good money for a chance to win a coveted radio or vacuum cleaner, especially if it means they don't have to risk wasting their precious ration coupons. You meet him on the corner of 8th and 3rd, or maybe it's 7th and 2nd, and there's one place where everyone is required to sit, right in front of the mirror. So what's the best way to get information? Simple. Get yourself a haircut. You listen carefully to every other conversation happening in the room. Plus you get a free shave. Well, almost free. The barber might charge you a couple of nickels, but he'll use those to buy supplies. You know what I'm saying? Gotta keep that cycle going. And while you're sitting there, you can take a look at yourself. Is this really what you look like? Maybe it's time for a style update. A slick new haircut might just be what you need to boost your morale. And you've got to look your best for those victory loan drives. Plus, you never know who you're gonna meet. My buddy Joe got himself a sweet new job. After Joe the barber hooked him up with the owner of Parker Brothers Games. Who knew Monopoly would take off like that? Anyway, the point is, people are gonna talk. Listen closely. You never know what you might hear. And if you're lucky, you might just save the life of your country. Actually, it doesn't matter, just walk down the street and you'll find him. Thanks for listening. And stay tuned for more stories. He's got the stuff you want. Don't worry, he's got it all. And you won't believe the prices. For instance, 3 cans of tomatoes and a can of tomato puree is just 60 cents. That's a steal, especially if you're planning on canning your own food. And maybe you want to start a little side business. Who knows? You might be the next great food baron. And speaking of being the next big thing, how about you become a spy? You know, this is wartime. Everyone's looking for the next juicy bit of gossip, and if you ask me, the best place to get it is the barbershop, and nobody wants to risk that, trust me. But you can't blame them for trying, because a guy's gotta eat, right? And you'd be surprised at what people will try to sell you. Like this guy's pet turtle. Sure, it's cute, but you can't eat it, unless you happen to be in a certain part of New York City, because they've got a thing for exotic meats. They're like alligator and kangaroo. But I hear tell they're also selling turtle steak. Apparently, it's delicious. Say, do you want to buy a turtle? Because I've got a guy. You just have to know what he wants. Oh, and did I mention he also happens to carry a gun? Those packages arriving at the post office have to come from somewhere. Sure, Aunt Tilly would love to help you out, but unless she wants to get investigated by the Treasury Department for possible profiteering, she's only sending what she's allowed to send. So where do all these black market goods come from anyway? After all, there are thousands of people working at the docks, sorting through all of these crates and boxes. There have got to be a few honest folks among them who don't mind helping out a friend. Or maybe you ask the guy waiting in line at the butcher shop. He looks like he's been waiting here since breakfast. But word on the street is, this guy could get you anything you wanted, assuming you had the cash. As for paying with ration coupons, forget it. He doesn't even want your trade dollars. He wants real money, and boy does he know where to get 'em. So, all you need to do is fill out this little form, and the government will take care of the rest. Huh, take that, Axis powers. Nothing says freedom like Uncle Sam slipping a whole bunch of cheese and chocolate in your mailbox. Yeah, but where's the beef? Sorry, couldn't resist. Back at the post office, you watch the clerk put the finishing touches on your package, seal it up, slap on a new stamp and drop it in the mail. Shoot. Next stop, Wisconsin. It'll probably arrive in about a week. Do you think it's going to be worth the wait? Hey, the clerk asks, anything for me? Nope. But, hey, thanks for asking. You drop off your stamp collection and leave. But maybe you should have asked because now the whole neighborhood knows you were just exposed to enemy contraband. And do you know what that means? Ration snit. This is an adjustment period, and so far it hasn't been easy. After all, these food shortages are kind of temporary. The agricultural industry is just adjusting to a whole bunch of new demands, right? Well, right now, everyone is feeling the squeeze. But there are those who are getting creative. Sure, the government is telling farmers to grow food for the troops, but that doesn't mean they can't also grow things for themselves. That farmer down the road might not be reporting every pig born on his property, and a certain someone might be filling his cellar with the fruits of his labor. Now, while it's true that hoarding meat and produce is frowned upon, there's nothing wrong with a little entrepreneurial spirit. And we all know that Farmer John is charging top dollar for those eggs and chickens. And when the local butcher starts selling sawdust cakes and sawdust pies, you know it's bad. If he can't get a hold of any meat, why should you? The black market is booming, and all you have to do is look around. You just need to know where to look. You dream of eggs over easy with sausage and strips of crispy bacon, all washed down with a mug of steaming black coffee. Your hands run into your pockets for a pack of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes or Camels, anyone. But all you find are ration booklets. Maybe you should just go straight to the source, the corner grocery store. Mr. Wiesenthal always seemed to have what you needed. Plus, he never asked to see your ration book. But then again, you know, he gets most of his stock from that big warehouse downtown. The same place where your boss says he buys his cigarettes by the carton. What if the feds raided the place? You do, I aren't want to be caught with illegal sugar hoarded from some poor sap who needs it more than you do. You head to the post office instead. At least the government isn't watching every letter you send. They're a little busy with the war after all. You ask your Aunt Tilly in Cleveland to send you some of that good old Wisconsin cheese you used to get at Christmas. And since she's already mailing cookies and candy to the boys overseas, she might as well add in some extra bars of handmade chocolate for you, too. That'll be a nice surprise for the kids. Who could ever say no to homemade chocolate? Not me. No, siree. Oh no, where there are rules, there are rebels. Enter the black market. Somewhere in a smoky back alley behind a butcher shop in Brooklyn, there's a guy named Louis. Louis knows a guy who knows a farmer who forgot to report a couple of hogs. Louis doesn't take ration coupons. He takes cash real, wrinkled, under-the-table cash for sausages that might as well be gold links. And it's not just Louis housewives smuggle sugar, cooks hoard butter. Someone's cousin accidentally got 6 pounds of coffee mailed from South America. And then there's you. You're standing in line for your weekly rations when your neighbor, Mildred, eyes your grocery bag a little too long. Is that real bacon? She hisses. You laugh nervously. She leans in. I'm calling the OP. Boom. Just like that. You've been ration snitched. But this is a wartime economy. And, even though your aunt loves you very much, she can only afford to mail you 1 package a month. And that includes postage. You know, they really ought to focus on something else besides making sure people stay within their point limit. For instance, that old man down the street who seems to be everywhere at once. He seems to know everyone, including seemingly every bootlegger and dope peddler in town. Let's talk about that. Oh yeah. I almost forgot to tell you about him. They've got everything going on in there. They've got politicians, truck drivers, businessmen, school teachers. If we hand you a box of old family photos, chances are it would be hard to understand what's going on in them without some context. Maybe you do see your great-grandma with a funny hat on and wonder why she wore that, or you do see your parents in high school and wonder how they got so much higher than the freshman 15. So why was everything rationed? Why did people accept it? And most importantly, how did anyone keep track of it all? During World War II, American factories converted their production lines to produce war materials, which created a labor shortage and led to fewer consumer goods being produced. On top of that, rationing was meant to boost morale by making sure everyone had enough of the essentials to get by. Well, maybe it worked, but we're not so sure, since millions of Americans still had to stand in bread lines during the war. It asked you for details about your family size, employment status, and whether you had access to other sources of food like a farm. Each household got a booklet of 48 stamps that looked a little bit like this. Each stamp represented either a certain amount of money or a certain amount of goods. For example, 3 stamps might represent 3 pounds of butter. Well, the answer depends on how well you understand fractions. To avoid cheating, they had to punch the stamps in specific directions and locations. They also had to keep detailed records of what they sold and to whom. That way, if the government inspectors came around, they could check the stamps and receipts to make sure the store owner wasn't ripping anyone off. Gas, shoes, and even old newspapers were in short supply, too. In 1942, drivers were limited to buying just 3 gallons of gas per week. If you were in size 9, you could use 14 coupons to buy a pair of men's shoes, but if you were a size 10 or larger, you'd need 15. The following year, however, that limit was increased to 8. Still, people couldn't just drive wherever they wanted, but most people didn't bother. By that time, they were tired of living in shoes that pinched their pockets. You know the drill. You walk into the store, hand over your stamps, get your goods and head home happy. But wait, your dinner tastes weird. The coffee is gritty, the milk has gone bad. You take the offending items back to the store, but the owner looks confused. He doesn't speak English and he definitely isn't interested in taking your stamps. Back at home, you dig through your collection of ration books and look for the store's name. Sure enough, you find that they only accept certain coupons for returns. Now you have to get your rear end back to the store and hope they have what you need. So when the rationing ended in 1946, they took the opportunity to upgrade to fancier, roomier footwear. Local governments often issued permits restricting where you could go and when you could use your gas to get there. Let's say you wanted to buy 2 pounds of meat. So what do you think? Was rationing a necessary evil or an overblown hassle? Let us know in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Some butchers, for example, would save up customers' leftover stamps and use them to buy luxury goods for themselves. Others would sell their stamps on the black market. There, people could buy almost anything, except instead of cash, they used something called ration points. You'd have to find a cut that costs exactly 10 points. Otherwise, you'd end up with an awkward number of leftovers. You could only use them at special stores, but they were easier to trade than actual currency, since they didn't involve banks or governments. Unfortunately for profiteers, the government cracked down on unofficial exchange markets and shut them down. Maybe you'd have to settle for lamb leg, which cost 9 points per pound, and then use your leftover points to buy something else. To buy a can of tomatoes, you'd have to turn into stamps. Civilian shoes had to be made from less durable materials, which meant they didn't last as long. To compensate, the government started rationing them in 1943. Every customer got a booklet of 6 coupons, 1 for a pair of half soles, 1 for heels, 1 for the uppers, 1 for the insoles, 1 for the quarters, and 1 for the rest of the shoe. Yep, you heard that right. To buy 1 pair of shoes, you needed 7 coupons. Or if you wanted to buy 3 pounds of pork, it would cost you 5. If you had extra stamps at the end of the week, you could turn them in for something else. Say you only needed 2 pounds of meat, so you turned in 8 stamps to get them. Then later in the week, you could turn in those remaining 6 stamps for some extra sugar. Just below the pictures of all American foods, there were blank spaces where the store would stamp your sheet. The number of stamps you got depended on where you lived, how many people were in your family, and whether any family members were working in defense industries. At the beginning of the war, most families received 4 stamps per week, but as the war dragged on, so did our hunger, and by 1943, most families were getting 8. Once that was done, you waited for your registration card to arrive in the mail. If you lost it, you had to contact the War Food Administrator office to get a replacement. You open up your fridge and realize you're out of both eggs and butter. No problem, right? You turn in 11 stamps and get what you need. Well, if only it were that simple. You see, every food item was given a point value based on how much it cost before rationing. A pound of butter was 5 points, as was a dozen eggs. 3 pounds of chicken cost 9 points, so you wouldn't be able to turn in 11 stamps for those items. Instead, you'd have to turn in 15. Well, after this short, you'll know more about rationing than you ever thought possible. For example, sugar was capped at 9 cents per pound, while it was actually worth around 28 cents. Since no one could make a profit selling sugar, it discouraged people from hoarding it, and it ensured that it stayed on shelves instead of being stockpiled by greedy rich people. But if we showed you this photo, you'd immediately understand the context. Only those who bought their sugar through ration points were eligible, and to get those ration points, you had to be registered for rationing. Now, don't get us wrong, we love paperwork as much as the next person, but we admit this next part gets complicated. This is a ration book from World War II, and the fact that it's yellowed and worn tells you all you need to know about its owner. But the whole system of rationing wasn't just about food. It also applied to things like shoes, milk, and even gas. So why was everything rationed? Well, not everything. Only stuff that was in short supply. In order to ensure that only those who really needed it got essential goods, the government put price controls on basic commodities. But then came the rub. You see, these low prices weren't available to everyone. First, you had to fill out a booklet called a registration certificate. With that in hand, you could start trading your points for stamps. Then came the third step. Now, this might sound easy, but let's say you're trying to buy some chicken. But let's say you only had 15 stamps and wanted to buy a mix of goods. How much of each could you buy? And if you thought that was confusing, try being a store owner. But even with all this paperwork, people were still able to cheat the system. Ration points were like monopoly money for World War II America. Now, so far, we've mostly been talking about food, but meat wasn't the only thing. As for shoes, they were rationed because leather and rubber were needed for military applications. Of course, everyone's feet are different sizes. So what happened if you needed a size large Marge? You got lucky. At the end of the war, everyone got a bonus of 16 kubans, which they could use to buy whatever shoes they wanted. There was one more thing that people were eager to stop rationing. Well, fret not, my friend. We have the perfect solution for you.